I heard them before they saw me. That was the thing about old houses, the floors talked. 42 years in that colonial on Birchwood Lane, and I knew every creak, every groan, every whisper that wood made when weight pressed down on it in the dark. I was standing in the hallway outside the kitchen at 11:40 at night, one hand on the wall, and I heard my son's voice, low and careful, saying my name. Not to me, about me. I stood there in the dark, and I listened. That was 3 weeks before I changed every lock in the house, emptied one bank account entirely, and handed a manila envelope to my attorney that made my son go white as chalk in a courtroom. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Walter. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer, mostly bridges. I understand how things hold together and how they fall apart. I understand load-bearing systems and stress fractures and the exact moment when something that looks solid on the outside has already begun to fail at its core. I retired 4 years ago when my wife, Carol, got sick. She passed 14 months after her diagnosis. Pancreatic. Fast and brutal and nothing we could do. After Carol died, I was alone in a house that had been built for 4 people. Us, our son Derek, our daughter Patrice, who moved to Portland 12 years ago and calls every Sunday without fail. The house was paid off. I had my pension, my 401k, and the investment accounts Carol and I had built together over 30 years of careful living. I wasn't rich by anyone's dramatic standard, but I was comfortable. The house alone was appraised at $840,000 the previous spring. Derek knew that number. Derek had, I would later learn, been thinking about that number for quite some time. He was 38. He worked in commercial real estate, or had until 18 months ago when the company he worked for downsized and let him go. His wife, Sandra, had her real estate license, but hadn't closed a deal in over a year. They had a house in Naperville with a mortgage that had been refinanced twice, a car payment on a vehicle that was too expensive for their current income, and a private school tuition bill for their daughter, my granddaughter Lily, that I had been quietly helping with for 2 semesters. I want to be honest about that. I helped willingly. Lily was 9 years old and had done nothing wrong, and I wasn't about to let her education suffer because her parents had made decisions that outpaced their means. Carol would have done the same. So I wrote the checks, and I didn't make Derek feel small about it, because I remembered what it was to be struggling and proud at the same time, and I didn't want to add shame to his burden. I think, looking back, that my willingness to help without conditions was something Derek mistook for something else entirely. He and Sandra had been staying with me for 6 weeks when I heard them in the kitchen that night. They'd come for what was supposed to be 10 days. The heat went out in their house in January. The repair was taking longer than expected. Could they stay while it was sorted out? Of course, I said. Of course. Lily's room was already set up from Christmas. I made the guest room comfortable for Derek and Sandra, and I told them to treat the house like home. I meant it kindly. They took it literally. Sandra began reorganizing the kitchen by day 3. Derek started having phone calls in my study. Door closed. The 10 days became 3 weeks, then a month, then 6 weeks. And when I gently asked about the progress on their heating system, Derek told me it had turned into a much bigger issue, something with the pipes now. They'd discovered water damage. It could be months. He looked at me with that particular expression, the one that was calibrated to be somewhere between helpless and hopeful, and I said, "Of course, stay as long as you need." 2 days later, I overheard Sandra on the phone in the hallway outside the laundry room. She didn't know I'd come down the back stairs. She was saying, "He's fine. He's easy. He doesn't really track things anymore. Last week, he couldn't remember where he put his glasses for 20 minutes. A pause. Then she laughed, a short, dry sound. I know, it's actually perfect timing. I went back upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed Carol and I had shared for 34 years, and I thought about what perfect timing meant. And I thought about the fact that I had, in fact, misplaced my glasses for 20 minutes last week, but that I'd also just finished rereading a 700-page biography of Robert Moses, and that I'd been doing the Sunday crossword in ink for 40 years, and that I remembered every load calculation from the Hendrix Overpass project in 2009 without needing to look at a single note. I was not losing my mind. But I understood, sitting on that bed, that someone wanted to make a case that I was. I didn't let on. That was the hardest part. I had been an honest man my entire life, blunt to a fault, Carol always said. Sometimes too direct, sometimes saying the hard thing when a softer version would have served just as well. Holding what I now knew inside me and continuing to act as though nothing had changed required a kind of discipline I hadn't practiced before. But I am an engineer. I understand patience. I understand that you do not make decisions about a structure until you have all the data. I needed data. I started paying attention differently. I had always been present in my own home, but I had not been watching. Now I watched. I noticed that Derek had taken to sitting with me in the evenings, which he hadn't done much in the first weeks, and that the conversations he steered us toward always circled back to the same general territory: how I was managing, whether the house felt like too much, whether I'd thought about what came next. He never said anything direct. He was careful. But the shape of what he was building was becoming clear to me, the way the outline of a bridge becomes clear when you understand the engineering underneath it. One evening, he brought up a name, a man named Cliff Hartwell, who he described as a financial advisor who specialized in estate planning for retirees. Very respected, Derek said. Really helps people get their affairs organized so the family doesn't have to deal with complications later. He'd be happy to come by, just to talk. No obligation. Derek had already spoken to him. I said that sounded fine. I also called my attorney the next morning. His name is Franklin Pruitt. We've been friends since 1987. We were in the same neighborhood watch association back when the neighborhood actually needed watching, and we'd stayed close through everything. Frank retired from his firm 2 years ago, but kept his license active. I told him what I'd observed. I told him about Sandra's phone call. I told him about Cliff Hartwell. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Walter, I want you to do something for me before this Hartwell comes by. I want you to go to your bank in person today, and I want you to talk to the branch manager about adding a verbal authorization requirement to any account changes. And I want you to pull any documents from your filing cabinet that have your signature on them and bring them to my office." I asked him why. "Because what you're describing has a pattern," he said. "And I've seen this pattern before. It doesn't always end in a courtroom, but it's better to be ready than to be surprised." I did what Frank asked. I went to the bank. I talked to the branch manager, a woman named Rita who had known me since Derek was in high school. I explained that I wanted to add a layer of security to my accounts. She didn't ask for details. She was efficient and kind and had everything updated within 40 minutes. Then I went home and I went through my filing cabinet and I found something that made me sit down in the desk chair and hold very still for almost 5 minutes. A document I did not remember signing. It was a form, a financial power of attorney document, partially filled out, with what appeared to be my signature at the bottom. Derek's name was printed in the designated field for the appointed agent. The date on it was 3 weeks prior, a Tuesday, which I could account for entirely. I had been at the dentist in the morning and at the hardware store in the afternoon. I had not been home. I had not signed anything. I looked at that signature for a long time. It was close. It was very close. But I had been signing my name for 67 years, and there was a particular way I looped the L in Hollis, my last name, that was habit so deep it was nearly unconscious. The loop on this signature was slightly too large, almost imperceptible, but wrong. I photographed the document with my phone. I put it back exactly where I found it. I went downstairs and I made myself a cup of coffee and I sat at the kitchen table and I thought about my son, who I had coached in Little League, who I had taught to drive in an empty parking lot on a Saturday morning, who had cried at his mother's funeral in a way that had broken my heart open because it was the most honest thing I'd seen from him in years. I thought about all of that, and then I thought about the forged document in my filing cabinet, and I made a decision. I was going to let this play out, all the way to the end, because stopping it halfway would only mean it came back in a different shape when I wasn't looking. I needed it finished, completely and permanently finished. Frank agreed with me when I brought him the photograph. He looked at it carefully, and then he looked at me and he said, "You understand what this means?" "I do," I said. "And you want to proceed?" "I want it done," I said. "The right way, with evidence, with consequences." Frank nodded slowly. He told me what to do. The first thing I did was buy a small audio recorder, the kind that looks like a pen. I began keeping it in my shirt pocket. Every conversation that happened in that house, I recorded. I didn't do it with any sense of drama. I did it the way I had taken measurements on job sites, methodically, consistently, without emotion. What I collected over the following 2 weeks was more than I had expected. Derek talking to Sandra in the kitchen, thinking I was asleep, about whether the Hartwell meeting had gone well enough. Sandra saying that I had seemed confused about the second page of the documents, which was good. Derek saying they needed me more visibly confused, more consistently, before they could move forward with the next step. Sandra mentioning a doctor, not my doctor, someone she'd found through someone Derek knew from his real estate contacts. A doctor who did home evaluations. For cognitive assessments, I stood in the hallway and I let those words settle into me, and I recorded every one of them. The Hartwell meeting had happened the week before. Cliff Hartwell had come to my house in a good suit, carrying a leather portfolio, with the practiced warmth of someone who had sat in a lot of living rooms with a lot of elderly people and knew exactly how to make himself seem trustworthy. He was perhaps 50, salt and pepper hair, very good handshake. He spread documents on my coffee table and explained them in the slow, slightly over-enunciated way that told me he had already decided I was diminished. I asked questions, detailed questions, about specific clauses, about tax implications, about the difference between a durable power of attorney and a springing power of attorney, about the revocation process, about the fiduciary responsibilities of the designated agent. I watched his composure slip just slightly at the edges. He hadn't expected that. Derek, sitting beside him, had gone rigid. I did not sign anything. I told them I wanted to take the documents to my own attorney before I put my name on anything. Hartwell said that was completely reasonable. Absolutely, of course. Derek smiled, the smile that didn't reach his eyes. After Hartwell left, Derek told me he was just trying to help, that he didn't want me to have to worry about all this when things got harder. What things? I asked. He looked at me with something that was trying to be compassion. Dad, you've had some moments lately. Sandra and I have both noticed. We're not saying anything is wrong. We care about you. We want to make sure everything is in order. I appreciate that, I said. And I went upstairs and I recorded my notes on the conversation while the details were fresh. And I called Frank and I told him what had been said. Frank told me the next phase was beginning. He said I needed to be prepared for the doctor visit. He told me to be myself entirely, completely myself during the evaluation. Don't perform confusion, but don't perform sharpness either. Just be Walter. Just answer honestly. The doctor came on a Thursday afternoon. His name was introduced to me as Dr. Morrow. He arrived without a white coat, in ordinary clothes, carrying a tablet, and the way Derek introduced him was as a friend of a colleague who did wellness check-ins for seniors, very informal, nothing medical about it, just a conversation. I shook the man's hand and offered him coffee and sat across from him in the living room while Sandra and Derek made themselves scarce in the kitchen. He asked me standard orientation questions. The date, the year, the current president. He asked me to recall 3 words after a delay. He asked me to draw a clock face showing 10 past 11. He asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens. He asked me to explain a recent decision I'd made and walk him through my reasoning. I answered everything correctly. I drew the clock precisely. I counted backward without error. When I explained a recent decision, I chose the conversation I'd had with my financial institution 2 weeks prior about the security modifications on my accounts, and I walked him through my reasoning in full detail, including the specific regulatory context. Dr. Morrow had stopped typing about 4 minutes into the evaluation. When it was over, he packed up his tablet and shook my hand again and said it had been very nice to meet me. His eyes, when they met mine at the door, were difficult to read something between professional neutrality and something more uncomfortable that he didn't let surface. After he left, Derek found me in the kitchen and asked how it went. Fine, I said. He seemed like a careful man. Derek nodded. He looked like someone doing arithmetic in his head that wasn't coming out the way he'd hoped. What Derek didn't know was what I'd learned about Dr. Morrow. Frank had done some checking. The man's medical license was real, but his practice had been sanctioned twice in the last 4 years, once for billing irregularities and once for a complaint from a patient's family member about the nature of a cognitive assessment that had been used in a legal proceeding. He was not, in Frank's careful phrasing, someone whose professional opinions carried much weight in front of a judge who'd seen him before. 3 days after the doctor visit, I found a second document in the filing cabinet. This one was a deed transfer. Preliminary, unsigned, but drafted. My property listed as the asset, Derek's name, and Sandra's name as the transferees. The language was standard, which told me whoever had drafted it knew what they were doing. But the date field was blank. They were waiting for something, likely the cognitive assessment to be used as the foundation for some claim that I lacked the capacity to manage my own affairs. I photographed it. I put it back. I called Frank, and I told him I thought we had what we needed. Almost, Frank said. I want one more thing. I want them on record making the ask directly. I understood what he was asking me to do. It was not comfortable, but I understood the engineering of it. You don't pull a support beam until you're sure the rest of the structure will hold. That weekend, I told Derek I'd been thinking. I told him I was tired. The house was a lot to manage. The maintenance, the yard, the taxes, all of it. I said maybe he was right that I should think about getting things organized. I said maybe this Hartwell fellow wasn't such a bad idea after all. I watched Derek's face very carefully. There was relief there, but underneath it, moving fast, was something more eager than a son who simply wanted his father protected. It moved through his eyes and was gone before he thought I'd seen it. He said he'd set something up. He made the call right there in the kitchen, turned slightly away from me, keeping his voice casual. I stood at the counter, and I made myself a sandwich, and I kept the pen recorder running in my shirt pocket. Hartwell came back 4 days later. This time there was no portfolio of general planning documents. He brought specific forms. He sat across from me, and he walked through them, and the language, when I read it carefully, was not the language of an estate plan meant to protect my interests. It was the language of transfer. Expedited transfer. Forms that would, if executed, give Derek and Sandra joint control of the property and the 3 largest financial accounts, immediately and irrevocably, with a clause that described me as having provided informed consent following independent consultation. I read every page. Hartwell waited with professional patience. Derek sat beside him and said nothing. I looked up and I said, "Derek, is this what you want?" He said yes. He said it was for my protection. He said it was so I didn't have to worry. I said, "I need to use the restroom. I'll be right back." I walked down the hall, and I sent Frank a text with one word: now. Frank had been parked 2 streets over for 40 minutes. I came back to the living room, and I sat down, and I said I had a few more questions about the documents, and I kept Hartwell talking for 12 minutes until the doorbell rang. Derek started to get up. I told him I'd get it. I walked to the door and I opened it, and Frank Pruitt came in carrying his own briefcase, looking exactly like what he was, a man who had spent 30 years in a courtroom and still remembered every detail of how it worked. The silence in that living room was a particular kind of silence. I have been on job sites when something shifts in a way it shouldn't, a sound, a vibration, something not right, and everything stops. Everyone goes still. This was that silence. Frank introduced himself. He said he was my attorney and had been for the past several weeks, and that he'd been retained specifically in response to some concerns I had shared with him. He placed his briefcase on the coffee table. He opened it. He put on the table, in sequence, a photograph of the first document, the partial power of attorney, with a forensic note I had not mentioned. Frank had quietly engaged a document examiner, a woman who had testified in forgery cases, who had provided a written opinion that the signature did not match my verified signature samples. He placed the photograph of the deed transfer document. He placed a printed transcript of the audio recording from the kitchen, Derek and Sandra's conversation about needing me more visibly confused. He placed the results of his background check on Dr. Morrow, including the 2 sanctions. He placed a letter from the financial institution confirming that any attempted changes to my accounts would trigger a mandatory phone verification with me directly and a 72-hour hold, as I had already arranged. and he placed a single additional document, a letter from the state attorney's office, whom Frank had contacted 3 days earlier, indicating that a fraud complaint had been received and was under preliminary review. Hartwell stood up first. He said something about a misunderstanding. Frank told him to sit down. Frank said something to him very quietly that I couldn't fully hear, but the effect was immediate and total. Hartwell sat back down. His color had changed. Derek looked at me. I looked back at him. There are moments you spend your whole life trying not to arrive at. I had not wanted to be sitting in this room. I had not wanted any of this to be true. I had spent 67 years trying to be someone my children could look at without flinching, someone Carol could have been proud of, someone who did things the right way even when the wrong way was easier. And I had loved my son. I want to say that clearly, plainly. Without qualification, I had loved my son with the complete and uncomplicated love of a father who believed, even in the difficult years, that the best version of his child was real and reachable. I had not wanted to be right about this. Derek said my name. He said, "Dad." I said, "Don't," and I meant it gently. I meant it the way you mean something that is over. Frank laid out what would happen next with the precision of someone who had done this before. Hartwell would be cooperating with the state inquiry, or he would not. That was his decision to make. Derek and Sandra would be vacating the house within 48 hours, with nothing beyond their personal belongings, and any attempt to access the property or any financial accounts in my name would result in the criminal complaint moving forward immediately, rather than remaining at the preliminary stage where Frank had, as a courtesy, held it. Derek started to speak twice. Both times he stopped. Sandra was quiet the entire time. She sat very still, and she looked at the documents on the table, and she did not look at me once. 48 hours later, they were gone. I stood in the living room after the door closed, and the house was quiet in the way it had been quiet for the past year and a half. The real quiet, not the layered quiet of people moving through it who shouldn't have been there. I could hear the refrigerator hum. I could hear a car pass on Birchwood Lane. I could hear the old colonial talking to itself the way it always did, boards settling, the particular language of a house that had been standing for a long time. I went to the kitchen, and I made coffee, and I called Patrice in Portland. She answered on the second ring, the way she always did. I told her I had something to tell her, and she said okay. And I told her most of it, not all of it. Not yet. There would be time for the full account, but enough. When I finished, there was a long quiet on her end, and then she said, "Dad, I'm coming out there." I told her she didn't need to. She said she knew that. She said she was coming anyway. She arrived 2 days later. She sat at the kitchen table where I had sat so many evenings with Carol, where Derek had eaten cereal as a teenager, where Lily had drawn pictures with crayons the previous Christmas, and she drank her coffee, and she listened to the rest of it. When I showed her the photographs of the documents, she was very still for a long moment. Then she said, "What do you need?" I told her what I needed was for things to be straightforward for a while. I told her I needed to finish the crossword on Sunday mornings without complications. I told her I needed to tend to the garden when the weather got warmer, because Carol had started that garden 20 years ago, and it didn't run itself. Patrice smiled. It was the same smile she'd had as a small child, slightly crooked on the left side, genuine without trying to be anything else. She said, "I can do that." The state inquiry moved forward over the following months. Frank kept me informed at each step. Hartwell surrendered his financial advisor certification and entered into a civil settlement that I was not a party to but was informed of. The forged document was referred to the county prosecutor. Derek, ultimately, was not charged criminally. The prosecutor made a determination about the available evidence and the likelihood of conviction that Frank explained to me in careful, precise language. I did not agree with the outcome, but I understood it. What Derek did face was a civil judgment. The forensic examination of the forged signature, the recordings, the draft deed transfer, Frank took those into a civil proceeding, and the outcome was clear. Derek and Sandra were ordered to pay the cost of the legal proceedings, which was not inconsiderable, and a restraining order was put in place that prohibited them from attempting to influence, manage, or make any claims against my estate or property for a period of 7 years. 7 years. I try not to spend too much time thinking about what that number represents in terms of the relationship between a father and a son. Some things break cleanly, and some things break in a complicated way, and you live with the shape of what's left. I had my attorney draw up a new will, properly structured, witnessed by two people who were not family members, certified and filed. I had a conversation with Patrice about what I wanted, and she listened, and she didn't argue, and she didn't try to steer me. We talked about Carol, too, for a while, the way the conversation sometimes goes sideways into memory. The kind of sideways that isn't bad. That's actually necessary. Patrice had Carol's way of listening without interrupting. I had always been grateful for that. In March, I replanted the garden beds along the south side of the house. The ones Carol had put in the year Patrice was born, that had been allowed to go a little ragged through the winter of my distraction. I found the specific bulbs she had liked at the nursery, 2 towns over, and I planted them the way she had always planted them, close together, which she said was wrong, according to the instructions, but which she insisted produced better results. She was right, as she generally was, about practical things. Lily calls me on Saturdays now. Derek arranged it through an intermediary, a text relayed through his sister. I had not expected that. But Lily is 9 years old and had done nothing wrong. She calls on Saturday mornings and tells me what she's reading and what happened at school, and sometimes she puts her cat on the video call so I can see it, which I find unexpectedly pleasant. I don't think about what I had to do to get here very often. When I do, I try to think about it the way I thought about hard problems at work, not as tragedies, but as structural challenges. Something was failing. I found the stress fractures before the whole thing came down. I shored it up. The bridge held. Some evenings I sit on the back porch, where the garden is, and the light comes across the south beds in the late afternoon. And I think about Carol. I think about what she would have said if I'd told her all of this, the 12 nights of standing in the dark, listening, the pen recorder in my shirt pocket, the moment Frank laid those documents on the coffee table. She would have been angry first, the way she always got angry, quiet and precise, not loud. She would have been hurt in a way she'd have tried not to show me, because she knew it would make me feel it more. And then she would have said something practical and clear, something that cut through everything unnecessary and identified what was actually true. She would have said, "You handled it, Walter." She would have said, "Now stop chewing on it and come inside." I am 67 years old. I live alone in a house on Birchwood Lane that I know by every sound it makes in the dark. My daughter calls every Sunday. My granddaughter calls every Saturday. My attorney is my friend. My garden is coming in along the south side the way Carol always said it would if you planted the bulbs too close together and trusted the process. I know every creak in these floors. I know exactly what weight sounds like when it moves through this house. And I know the difference between a house that is standing and a house that only looks like it is. This one is standing. I made sure of it.